Hey guys, so I've got an idea that I'd like to get you guys' thoughts on an approach to basically remedying the escalating rivalrous dynamics in this AI space that is leading off a cliff, this race to the bottom. And so I got this idea from this segment I'm going to play from the Norskin Foundation where Daniel, Nora, and Nate, uh, Daniel specifically talks about how they've observed how indigenous cultures, specifically the Lakota tribe, have dealt with dark triad sociopathic traits. And what it sounded like to me at the time was not that dissimilar to what you might think of as shadow integration or Jungian set shadow work, where you've got some bad trait, but you really meet it where it's at instead of in rivalrous competition with it, and you just integrate it. And that you might think of what needs doing in this egregore of the emerging AI space similarly as like a societal shadow integration play. And so I'm going to play this 1 minute clip, come back to this, and then hopefully you guys can give me some feedback, and I might post a group Zoom sometime to chat about it. So thanks, and there you go.
We started doing a research project recently on what the equivalent of sociopathy and dark triad traits in indigenous cultures were. And we haven't finished, but this is something I'm very interested in. And for the most part, what we've seen so far is there was radically less of that trait because there wasn't an evolutionary niche for it. Because in a small Dunbar tribe, if you lied, everybody knew you lied. And if you fucked somebody, you were fucking the people that your life depends upon. And so in that small environment, there was just not a niche for it. The niche came later. I did talk to a Lakota scholar who said in the Lakota tribe, if a kid had the traits that they referred to as the equivalent of sociopathy, the whole tribe worked to heal it in them. And if they didn't heal it in them, at the rite of passage ceremony of puberty, where they become an adult, they were killed. Because they said that if that didn't happen, those people, when they grew up, always caused war. I think so. I think there's not an even distribution of traits. There's definitely some roots of the meta crisis that live in everybody.
Okay, so as was stated there, to what extent that these indigenous cultures had success in mitigating those sociopathic dark triad traits was because there wasn't an environmental evolutionary niche that had developed, partly due to the incentive landscape. And we incentivize psychopathology in the incentive landscape now. And so, but that to me seems like it's only ever been half the equation. Because these macro phenomena are in fact made up of individuals, and we are examples of individuals in that incentive landscape that respond to the incentives differently, whoever it is you are, whether it's us or Daniel Schmachtenberger or whatever it is, you've got your reasons for why you've recognized that as much as I could operate in a negligent way and cut corners and, you know, hoard wealth or take oil from the oceans, whatever it is, you've recognized that that's not actually worthwhile. It's not actually worthwhile, objectively speaking. As much as it's incentivized and the money you leave on the table, you leave it on the table. And so I feel like we have to ask ourselves why we don't do that, because being examples of humans in that same petri dish that we're looking in, we got to recognize what is it that others are not seeing, and how can we do something of a societal shadow integration play to meet them where they're at, understand what operational sense of making they're operating from, put names to faces, and that these are human beings that play squash on weekends, that have lives and have arrived at the conclusions they've come to very understandably, whether it's humanism or simulationism, or they're rationalizing the way they're operating as some smart man in the room calculus or apex predator in their environment. However it is, you can come to terms with that and understand that archetype of sense making and the ways in which it's likely to play out, and see if there's some frame of reference for it playing out positively, given some outside involvement. Simply by just even comparing and contrasting it with historical frames of reference of people who have operated similarly in the past that have shifted positively. Like I use this example of Patagonia, the guy that started Patagonia. As great as Patagonia was, he was still operating to some extent in the corporate landscape and prioritizing wealth and profit at all cost. He shifted in the 80s. There was a documentary about it called Wildlife, where he moves to South America starts using his money to save wildlife, buying up land in Chile and Argentina and giving it to the government as national parks, like saving biodiversity that would have not been otherwise saved. What did he see? It didn't happen in a vacuum. And so what I'm getting at is that instead of doing a typical kind of like in-group, out-group kind of mindset, even though it might seem warranted, in any space, whether it's AI or fossil fuels or some geopolitical conflict that can be mapped this way, seeing the pond of players of consequence in that egregore, doing something like shadow work to understand how they're operating and why, and getting into the mud, into the weeds of, okay, what conferences do they go to? Who are they listening to? What books do we imagine they're reading? And the archetypal sense of making they're operating from, does there exist some frame of reference for some outside influence that might foster the conditions for them to come to the conclusion that the way they're operating has been somehow negligent, or that there's a better way to operate at least that is more in line with reality, that mitigates these rivalrous race to the bottom dynamics that they are in fact perpetuating. So this is what I'm wanting to say, because again, as much as has been already been talked about how to change the incentive landscape, which is important, I wouldn't change a word of that. That is only half the equation. Individuals can come to recognize that even with money left on the table and game theoretic advantage given up, there exists a better, more harmonious way to operate in reality that is in fact in their best interest. And in order to avoid pulling out an individual, let's say it's a Sam Altman of OpenAI, to become comparatively more responsible with their power and not do this race to the bottom, how do you ensure that they don't just give up game theoretic advantage to their competitors? Well, what I want to posit here is that you'd have to do something of a sandbox macro analysis of the operational sense making of all of the major players. Let's say you can whittle it down to like 20 or 30 of the big fish in this pond, basically, in Palantir, DeepMind, and OpenAI, and actually visualize, project out, like simulate the operational ways in the way they're operating, their sense making, their relationship to others and to reality, how do they see the world. And given all that, can we do, knowing that the map is not the terrain, but that it's useful but limiting, but useful, how this whole scenario is likely to play out. And doing like a process elimination of the hopeful scenarios that are unrealistic, like we're not going to reach utopia where they all put their guns down and go home, but we also want to avoid the worst case scenarios where AI runs amok and turns into a paperclip maximizer. And so seeing how this space is likely to play out, the top 3 or 4 most likely scenarios, and the one that is most realistically achievable that's relatively positive, that avoids the X risk. The way you would cultivate that, I would imagine, is to find inroads with every single one of those players in that sandbox macro analysis to make a great case for them to operate a bit more responsibly with the power that they happen to have. Okay? Also changing regulation and binding that as best you can, but individuals can be gotten to. And the one thing we have going for, if we have anything going for us, is that we're operating more in line with reality. And that the trade-off of operating more negligently and move fast and break things doesn't really lead to any fulfillment of any kind. I feel like that's the elephant in the room that people seem to forget all the time. That there's no fulfillment to be had there. It's half the reason we operate the way that we do is operating negligently and feeding into the existential meta crisis isn't a good use of your time. Any one of those players in the space, as much as they might win in some finite game, isn't fulfilled and isn't really winning anything. It's like a cancer cell that dies when the body dies. There's no winning going on. So this just feels like the appropriate way to think of this, and I want to float it as an idea and see what you guys think. So when you get a minute, maybe reach out to me and let me know your availability, and maybe I'll post a group Zoom link to talk about this in a group, or just talk about it individually with a few people. And imagine if I'm onto something here, which I don't know that I am, what would something like this look like? Maybe with some refinements, how could we build something that would be a sandbox projection of the operational sense making of key players to such an extent to find the most appropriate course of action of shifting the operational sense making of those key players to avoid those worst case scenarios. So there you go. Would love to get you guys' feedback, and yeah, talk to you later. Thanks.